What comes to mind when you think of Vikings? Thick beards reaching down to their chests. Warriors carrying enormous axes on their backs. Fearless men crossing the vast seas in dragon-headed ships. Odin in the sky. Thor on the battlefield. Endless feasts, immortality, and honor in Valhalla. Popular culture has portrayed Vikings this way for years. In TV series, movies, games. Being a Viking was a dream, a symbol of power, a story of freedom. But let me tell you a bitter truth. Most of it was exaggerated, or completely false. The real Viking life was not so much about being brave as it was about being desperate. They fought not because they loved to fight, but because they had to survive. A hot meal, a dry bed, a few months' worth of food. Sometimes they traveled hundreds of miles and burned villages and slaughtered people for these things. Those men you think of as heroes, sometimes they killed their own brothers. Some left behind their mothers, wives, and children to go to war. Some never returned home, dying of cold or hunger in the forest. But these things are not often mentioned in history books, because they don't sound heroic, ... Where women were forced to remain silent, children were enslaved at a young age. Where winters lasted for months, and every day began with the fear of death. Where brother was enemy to brother, neighbor a potential threat. Imagine a life woven with blood, mud, and fire. That was the real Viking life. Exactly that. In this video, I'm going to tell you the truth, not the myths. And the truth is much darker than you think. Why did the Vikings have to plunder everything? Most stories about Vikings portray them as ruthless warriors and bloodthirsty marauders. But were they really like that? Or did the lands they lived in force them to become marauders? Looting to survive. The Vikings lived in northern Scandinavia, in the cold, harsh, and barren lands of present-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Although it may sound romantic, living in these lands was almost a struggle for survival. Winter sometimes lasted up to 6 months. Most of the land was rocky and infertile. Farming was difficult. Crops were scarce, and animals froze to death in the winter. These people could not feed their large families by fishing or farming alone. So plundering was not a crime in their eyes. Plundering was a means of survival. Just as going to the market to buy bread is today, for a Viking, boarding a ship and raiding a village on another coast was the same. First raid, Lindisfarne 793. The most famous example of this is the Lindisfarne raid, which is mentioned in history books. The year was 793. An island isolated from the sea on the east coast of England. Lindisfarne Monastery was a sacred place where monks lived in peace. But for the Vikings, that monastery was a treasure chest. Gold, silver, books, valuable fabrics. And most importantly, food supplies. The ships quietly approached the shore. Axes were drawn. Within hours, the monastery was reduced to rubble. The monks were killed or enslaved. At that moment, Europe's nightmare began. But the Vikings did not carry out this attack for fun. It was the desperation of a man who had nothing to feed his family that winter. For them, plunder was not just a matter of survival, but the only way to ensure the continuation of their lineage. Why did they keep going to other places? Over time, the Vikings began to explore England, Ireland, France, and even Russia. This was because there was no abundance in their own lands. But in some parts of Europe, there were grain silos, rich monasteries, and unarmed villages. Europe was also politically fragmented during this period, and the kingdoms were weak. So the Vikings identified areas where they could obtain what they needed without encountering much resistance. And thus the Viking raids began. But this was not a conquest. It was a struggle against hunger and death. Not just wealth, slavery is also a goal. Another reason, the slave trade. The Vikings would gather slaves, whom they called thralls, from the regions they plundered, either using them on their own lands or selling them to the Arab world or Byzantium to make a living. Capturing a person was sometimes more valuable than gold, because that person was both a labor force and a bargaining chip. Think about it. You're an 18-year-old Irishman working in a field when the Vikings arrive. They kill your family, chain you up, and take you north. And you spend the rest of your life as a servant in a Viking farmhouse, living in a dark hut. That was the human tragedy of plunder, not just the material one. The root of plunder: culture or necessity. Over time, raiding ceased to be merely a means of survival and became part of their culture. Young men were considered men when they went on their first raid. A man who returned from a raid not only fed his family, but also earned respect in the community. But do you know how it all began? A child woke up to a morning when his mother couldn't find food. A man, searching for a last resort for his family, took up an axe. And at that moment, another Viking was born. The Vikings were not born warriors. Hunger made them warriors. And plunder was not a choice for them, but a necessity. The Vikings showed no mercy even to their own people. The horrific truth about clan wars. We think of the Vikings as a people united in battle against external enemies, but the truth is quite the opposite. The Vikings often fought their greatest battles within their own ranks. Not unity, but division prevailed. There was no centralized state, no single king, and no national army in the Viking world. There were hundreds of small tribes, clans, and families in Scandinavia. Each village could have its own leader, its own land, and even its own gods. And these small clans were often enemies of each other. A clan could go to war with another clan for stealing a cow. A broken marriage agreement could spark a blood feud between two great families that lasted for decades. And these wars were not limited to small skirmishes. Houses were burned, leaders were beheaded, children were taken as slaves. For the Vikings, the enemy was not just another nation, but often a neighbor who had once been a friend. Lands where brothers became enemies. One of the most painful examples of this occurred during the reign of King Harald Fairhair of Norway. Harald wanted to unite all of Norway under a single flag. But this idea of unity was a threat to the independent clan leaders. The result? Norway was ravaged by civil wars. Harald's own cousins, brothers, and former allies rose up against him. Some were captured and executed. Some were exiled. Others tried to stay on the throne by killing their own sons. There was no trust between them. Betrayal begat betrayal. And even when fighting their enemies, the Vikings could not turn their backs on their own people. Not only men, women and children were also targeted. Viking wars did not only take place on the battlefield. When one clan defeated another, not only warriors, but also families became targets. Women were raped, children were enslaved. Houses were burned down. All winter food supplies were destroyed. So war was not just death, but a long-term punishment of survival. Women who survived a Viking war buried their husbands in the ground while being enslaved by their new owners. This cruelty was not directed at the enemy, but at each other. Why were they so ruthless? So why? Why were they so ruthless? Why were brothers killing each other? The answer is actually simple. Resources were scarce. Land was scarce. The climate was harsh. Being strong wasn't enough to survive. You had to be more ruthless than your rival. That's why mercy was considered a weakness among the Vikings. To spare someone was to leave them to die in the next winter. If you turned a blind eye to a tribe, there was no guarantee that they wouldn't come and raid your village a few months later. Case study: the tragedy of Egil Skallagrimsson. An example from Icelandic sagas. There was a poet and warrior named Egil Skallagrimsson. His father had killed his own brother. Egil's brother was also treacherously trapped and killed by another Viking leader. Egil took revenge by beheading this leader's son on his wedding day after waiting 10 years. But the cycle did not stop there. Egil's grandson was also killed in another battle, and this chain of hatred continued for generations. Sometimes the Vikings' greatest enemy was not the coast of England. Sometimes the enemy was their cousins, with whom they had once grown up, and nothing could be resolved without bloodshed. Were Viking women really warriors, or were they victims? TV series, movies, games, they usually show us Viking women as warriors carrying shields, powerful figures wearing armor, holding spears, fighting shoulder to shoulder with men. But real history says this about most of these images. That's not exactly how it was. Viking women between reality and myth. Yes, Viking women were more free than women in some other societies. They could own property, divorce, and refuse to marry. But this freedom was very limited and often only belonged to the noble class. For ordinary women living in villages, life was spent not on the battlefield, but in the fields and at the hearth. They had a high chance of dying in childbirth. If they couldn't find firewood in winter, their children would freeze to death. And most were married off at a young age and traded like goods. Were there any real female warriors? So, were there no women who fought? Yes, there were. Some women, especially those who took their husband's place after his death or swore revenge, may have taken up arms. Archaeologists have found the skeletons of armed women in graves. However, these warrior women represented a very small fraction of the entire Viking population. So the idea that all the women you see in games were warriors is an exaggerated romanticism. Most women had to hide in a hut with their children when the war started. Being a woman, difficult even in her own society. Being a Viking woman meant fighting not only against enemies, but also against her own people. There were thousands of girls who were forced to marry someone they did not want to marry. Rape was common, even within marriage. A woman's right to say no was often only on paper. And childbirth, it was the most sacred thing, but also the most deadly risk. Many women lost their lives giving birth to their first or second child, and their place was filled by another wife. Slave women, silent victims. There were also women who were taken prisoner during the war. They were not Viking women, but rather property for the Vikings. They were forced to work in the fields, bear children, and sometimes even had their tongues cut out to prevent them from rebelling. These women had no stories. Their names do not appear in history books, but they were the invisible pillars of Viking society. They carried the burden and remained silent. Legend or reality, the story of Lagertha. Some sources mention a female warrior named Lagertha. When her husband was killed, she took up his shield, fought, and won victory. But how much of this story is true, and how much is myth, is still debatable. The truth is, there were female warriors. But this was not the rule, it was the exception. And most Viking women were heroes not in battle, but in the struggle to survive. The truth is, there were female warriors. But this was not the rule, it was the exception. And most Viking women were heroes not in battle, but in the struggle to survive. Being a Viking woman did not mean fighting with an axe. It meant trying to survive in the cold, in poverty, in silence. True heroism lay in those who managed to survive. Those who die in war are remembered, but those who struggle to survive every day are history's quietest heroes. What was it like to be a slave among the Vikings? Being a Viking was difficult, but being a Viking slave, that was an indescribable darkness. The Vikings weren't just raiders. They were also one of Europe's largest human traffickers. And this trade was conducted with blood, tears, and chains. Thrall, nameless, voiceless human. The Vikings called slaves thralls. A thrall is a person with no name, no free will, treated as little more than a piece of property. These people were usually enemy soldiers, women, and children brought from other countries. But sometimes they even enslaved members of their own people. A man who couldn't pay his debts, a child captured in a clan war, or a kidnapped villager. All of them were chained up and condemned to a lifetime of service on a Viking farm. Daily life: chains, sticks, and silence. As a Viking slave, you would wake up before dawn. You would tend to the animals with ice-cold water, clean the stables, chop wood, cook meals, and work in the fields. And then you would repeat the same cycle until sunset. But if you made a mistake, the punishment was brutal. There were slaves who were beaten with sticks for simply waking up late, had their hands burned with boiling water, or had their tongues cut out just for speaking. And no one knew what happened to most of them, because they were just things. Female slaves, the darkest truth. The situation was even darker for female slaves. Women captured in battle were both forced to work and used as sexual slaves. Viking men could take them as they pleased, trade them, or kill them. Even the baby of a slave woman who gave birth would be born into slavery. Thus, slavery was not just a fate, but a chain of inheritance. The heart of trade, the slave market. These people were used not only for domestic work, but also for trade. Just imagine a 9-year-old child being taken to Byzantium and sold in chains behind a war chariot. Viking slaves were traded from Istanbul to the Arabian deserts. These children were traded for coins, furs, and spices. The Vikings made so much profit from these slaves that in some regions, human exchange replaced currency. 1 sword equals 1 female slave. 1 boat equals 2 child slaves. These were just numbers. But every number had a face, and most of those faces did not survive. There was no escape. If a slave tried to escape, they were usually executed. Some were burned alive. Some were chained to the back of the ship and dragged until they drowned. Because for the Vikings, the loss of a slave was simply a loss of property, and they would kill without hesitation to protect their property. We boast of the Vikings' strength, but that strength was nourished by the suffering of others. Their magnificent halls were heated with the blood of slaves, and those slaves were not even mentioned in history. Why was being a Viking actually a terrible life? The Vikings, they weren't born with axes. They didn't breathe with swords. But life made them as ruthless as winter, as fierce as the sea. Hunger made them raiders. Brotherly strife made them merciless. Slavery made them cruel. And waking up every morning made them silent heroes. Being a Viking wasn't about being brave. Being a Viking meant having to swallow your fear, and being able to stand tall even in the darkness. So what do you think? Could you handle being a Viking in this life? I look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this dark journey through history, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to make sure you don't miss the next shocking video. Because the dark side of history is not over yet.